Hello, thank you for being in a new video. This time, I have full review of the ASUS ZenBook Duo 2024 edition. Let's get started. This is specifically the model that will be distributed in Mexico, so there could be variations with models from other regions. Its launch price here is 54,999 Mexican pesos. That is approximately $3,300. It is a very expensive computer, but very original in its concept. In spite of being expensive, it is not going to stand out for the highest level of graphic power, but in this case it bets on a very high level of productivity, giving us the option of having two screens in a single laptop. This is obviously going to be the most attractive feature, but we will now describe everything this computer has to offer so that you can decide whether it is what you are looking for or not. This computer is a little thicker than most computers, reaching 14.6 millimeters without the keyboard on and 19.9 millimeters with the keyboard on. Definitely for today's market it would be a bit thick, but we have to remember that we have two screens on this computer, which makes it much more productive. It is mainly built in polycarbonate in order to save some weight, since its total weight is 1.65 kilograms considering the keyboard. For such a compact computer, it can feel like a heavy computer. I guess that's why they didn't incorporate aluminum or metal into this computer, to try to minimize the weight. But honestly, for all the productivity you can gain, instead of having two laptops, you could have this laptop with two screens, just having a little more thickness and a little more weight. But remember that this keyboard is easily detachable and also features Bluetooth, so you can still use the keyboard even if it's not sitting on top of the computer. So we have the traditional laptop mode, but if you detach the keyboard, you can have a dual screen mode. That is, on the screen that's on the table, you're gonna be able to have a virtual keyboard with a virtual trackpad and with other tools that I'll show you later. But there is also the desktop mode, with which you could take advantage of the tab that brings this computer in the back to be a stand, and you can place your distribution of monitors vertically, so you gain a lot of space with two monitors and your keyboard removed. Or you could also place these screens horizontally, also having more space to work depending on the placement you like best. And finally, another mode of use that it offers us, thanks to the bisagra being able to open to 180 degrees, would be the sharing mode, which is a mode that's on the table with which you could show other members of your team or your friends what you're working on. It's definitely a computer that gives a lot of versatility, highly original in its proposal. And as I always like to tell you, something important is that it is able to open its screen without the need to use two hands, which gives you much more comfort. By the way, with respect to other details, this tab that comes on the back has an opening angle of 40 to 70 degrees. This flange is metallic, unlike the rest of the body of the device. And you can also take advantage of the case to have another accessory and give your computer a certain level of tilt of about 12 degrees, which could also help it with cooling. So it takes advantage of that as well. Included in the box is a case that's not only going to help you transport this computer safely, but it can also create a certain level of tilt so that you have better cooling for the computer. So it has dual function, both as a stand for your computer and as a case. And by the way, in this case you can also store the ASUS Pen 2. Oh, that comes built in. A stylus that might come in handy. We'll talk later about the software that you could take advantage of with this pen. But obviously it can help you make notes, drawings, and a lot more. This computer does include fans on the bottom. It does not have grills as large as we can see in gamer computers, but enough to try to cool the processor. We will talk much more about the performance later, but for now, to finish with the design, you should see that it has rubber feet to help the computer to have a good air circulation and also to help it not to slip on the tables. However, it does not have any slots to easily upgrade RAM or solid storage. On the other hand, the keyboard, which is detachable, also comes constructed of this same material. The keys have a good 1.4 millimeter travel. Considering it's a detachable keyboard, I think that's a good thing. We also get some concave keys for more comfortable placement of your fingers. And even what strikes me is that it's a backlit keyboard, even though it's a detachable keyboard. So it's going to offer us good features. Obviously, to support this light, it needs a little bit bigger battery, so it also offers us a USB-C port to be able to charge this keyboard. And if you were in doubt, this port will only serve to charge the keyboard and not to connect other accessories to the computer. This keyboard also has a switch to turn Bluetooth on and off. When it is mounted on top of the computer, you don't need to have the Bluetooth on, as it has pins under the trackpad that will connect to the computer. Therefore, it can save battery power when it is on top of the computer. The keyboard includes quick function keys such as to control the brightness, control the volume, and more. And if you want to change the behavior of these keys, you can press FN and escape. They will now act like the traditional phone, FTUIU, and so on. I like having the ability to change the behavior of these buttons, which also include a button to disable the microphone and a button to open emojis, which is not usually that common. So it is appreciated. If you're going to be working in social networks, you're probably going to get to use it a lot. Notice that through software, it also allows you to have clarity regarding how the FN key is working, and also allows you to have automatic brightness for the keyboard backlight. Plus, you could tell it to automatically turn off when you're in a very bright condition. And finally, it also has a button that would allow you to turn off the second screen. Although to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense because it only works when you have the keyboard detached. And obviously, when you have the keyboard detached, you most commonly want to use both screens. Being a compact computer, it doesn't include a numeric keypad, and the trackpad is 5.8 inches on its diagonal. It's a fairly wide trackpad, but obviously having a touchscreen, we don't need such an advanced trackpad, but it does support gestures and more. And in this case, practically the entire area of the trackpad is pressable, with the exception of the upper area, but in a very small area. So I did like the trackpad. In terms of connectivity, on the left side we are going to find the USB-A port 3.2 Gen 1. Personally, I like that modern laptops still incorporate this port because it can still be very useful. And then we find two USB-C ports, Thunderbolt 4, which will also offer very good speed. On the other hand, on the left side, we will find the HDMI output 2.1 and also jack for headphones or microphone. The only thing that might be pending would be a slot for micro SD cards or something like that, but honestly, it has a lot of internal storage, so I do not think you will need it. For a computer that aims to increase productivity a lot, I think the ports are varied enough. Regarding wireless connectivity, it also includes support for Wi-Fi 6E networks, which gives us the latest. Obviously, in conjunction with a good internet provider and a good router that supports Wi-Fi 6 networks, you could achieve some excellent download speeds, and it also has Bluetooth 5.3. Let's talk about the screens. In this case, both have exactly the same characteristics. Their resolution is 3K. Both are touchscreens with a size of 14 inches and OLED technology, plus a 16:10 ratio that would allow you to work comfortably while also taking good advantage to watch multimedia content. The exact resolution is 2880 by 1800 pixels, reaching a pixel density of 242 pixels per inch, which comes in handy for a device of these characteristics. Although the screen does not really reach such a high brightness because laptops are generally more focused on indoor use. So its maximum brightness with normal content is 400 nits, but it reaches 500 nits with a peak when watching HDR content. I insist. For indoor viewing, it is enough, but if you wanted to use this screen outdoors, it could fall a little short of the brightness for comfortable viewing. Also, they have 120 Hz in their refresh rate, and being OLED displays, they offer a good treatment as well, supporting 100% of the color gamut of that IP3, so the displays really give a very good experience. Although you have to consider that when you want to use the two screens at the same time, they will be slightly separated. That is, compared against laptop alternatives that might incorporate foldable screens. Obviously, there will be a difference here because of the split that is generated between these screens. But if you are used to working with two monitors, you will obviously get a very similar feeling, giving you plenty of room to work. And through software, it brings several options so that we can enhance our experience with OLED displays. Remember that OLED screens could be prone to a mark if it was constant content for a long time with a very high brightness. Then it brings an option to automatically activate a screensaver if you take 30 minutes without using it, regardless of your Windows sleep settings. In addition, it brings an option to make the Windows bar to hide, and to avoid that, it gets to be marked. Although also with the transparency effect, you could prevent this detail that can happen on OLED screens. So it is highly recommended that you enable these two options if you want to have an even better experience with a screen that will last longer. It also comes with flicker-free dimming so that when you're using the screen at very low brightness, you can have a more comfortable experience. And notice how it has multiple levels or multiple color calibration settings, including an eye care mode. So for the user, I think these are good options depending on how you like your colors and also what color gamut you want to use. It actually allows you to customize differently the color calibration of each of the displays, so it's curious. Plus, it has a technology called True to Life, which through artificial intelligence will enhance the images you're seeing for a more spectacular display of your videos. Obviously, it's up to you whether or not you want to use it. And you can also have a dynamic or fixed refresh rate in the purest cell phone style for a more adequate consumption of your battery. For the sound, we will find the speakers at the bottom. Fortunately, it does have two speakers, so it has stereo sound. But the placement is the one I don't like very much, since the sound bounces on the table and therefore the middle frequencies are increased a bit. So it is not a sound that I like too much, but fortunately it does have a good presence of bass frequencies to try to counteract this effect a bit. Although I would have liked much more to see a front speaker placement, but you have to consider that in laptops this small is a bit complicated to do that. Let's listen to a small test, although remember that it is not the same to listen to it live. These speakers integrate Dolby Atmos and are also certified by Harman Kardon, so I insist the sound is good, but the placement is not so good. In addition to having Dolby Atmos, note how it will integrate several surround sound presets depending on the one you want to use. In addition, we can still click on these settings to go to a more advanced configuration of Dolby Atmos. We find a multi-band equalizer. We can also have a volume leveler, so we can definitely have a very advanced Dolby Atmos configuration for a better experience in our sound. If we had the speakers on the front, it would be better, but obviously having a detachable keyboard, it is very complicated to find the perfect area for the speakers. It is also going to have a volume amplifier in case you want even more power, although honestly it already has a loud sound, and at maximum volume I feel it can generate a bit of distortion, so I would not recommend it so much. But if you need it for some content that has a very low volume, you can activate it to improve your experience. This computer integrates two microphones on the front, a very good audio pickup. Below you will hear a test captured with these microphones.
Esta es una prueba de audio utilizando los micrófonos integrados de esta computadora ASUS ZenBook Duo edición 2024.
Again, through the My ASUS application, we are going to be able to configure how we want these microphones to behave. If we want them to have a 360 sound pickup, or also if we want them to have a simply directional pickup to avoid outside noise, or an authentic recording without any kind of modification or any kind of noise cancellation. This comes in handy if you want to pick up some music or something similar. We're also going to have artificial intelligence features so that it identifies your voice and reduces all the noise that's not your voice, or also identifies the voices of multiple people, so it definitely has good options as well for what it has to do with microphones. The camera is placed on the top. It has a small LED indicator to know when it is being used, and it is able to give us full HD signal. In good lighting conditions, we have an excellent signal with good color saturation, good detail, and this camera also gives us a good level of amplitude. Although in more complex lighting conditions, it is perhaps not able to give a very clean signal. You notice a little bit of noise, although it also has different noise reduction mechanisms, for example in these darker areas. So video calls will look good, although obviously they still fall short of how they would look with a cell phone or tablet. As software, we will obviously find Windows. The only alternative would be Mac. In this most recent update, Copilot is integrated as an artificial intelligence assistant that you can ask for a lot of information. That can be very useful for many people, and it's very easy to access. So it's a tool that you're probably going to be using a lot, although it's not exclusive to this computer. In fact, several Windows tools will not be exclusive to this computer, so we're not going to mention them in this video. We're going to focus specifically on the software that ASUS has added. We had already been talking about the My ASUS application that comes pre-installed, through which you can modify several things on the system. For example, the fan mode, some other GPU tools and things that I had already mentioned to you a moment ago. So practically we have already seen this application, but it will also allow us to update the system and drivers to have a good performance at all times of this device. On the other hand, it also includes an application called GlideX, which, if you do not know, it will work to connect to our mobile device even if it is not of the ASUS brand, so you can have another cell phone and still keep a good interaction between them. Notice how it has many tools to take advantage of your cell phone. For example, we could have the projection of our cell phone directly on this computer. You just have to install the application and see how by scanning the QR I can make an extremely simple connection. Obviously, I have to give it the necessary permissions, and after that, I can make this projection. Even with the necessary configuration, you could get to control all your cell phone directly from the computer, but this does not always work. Actually, here I will get a pairing request, but it doesn't always work as I tell you, so you may face this kind of difficulty since it is not a perfectly integrated ecosystem in conjunction with a device of the same brand, but it is appreciated the effort to be able to operate a device of another brand directly from your computer. It also has options to extend the monitor directly to your cell phone, and again the operation is by scanning a QR code, or your cell phone can also be listed. Notice how by simply doing this action, now on my cell phone I will have a little more information. The process may take a little longer than I would like, but that's it. My cell phone is now acting as a second monitor, and notice how I can transfer windows to it and even interact using the touch screen. I could also use the cursor and keyboard to access my cell phone, or also use tools to transfer files either to the cell phone or to the computer, answer calls from the computer, and even use the camera on my cell phone as if it were the camera on my computer. So it can be very useful as well. We already saw that the computer camera is good, but it can definitely become better if you take advantage of this feature. Notice how the application detects two cameras. Let's switch to the other one, and that's it. It has low latency, and it definitely has an image quality that is completely superior to what the built-in camera gives us, so it can be a useful tool as well. And another application that ASUS adds is Screen Expert, through which we're going to be able to have a kind of quick widget on this part where we can modify the brightness individually per screen. We can also access the settings so that you specifically tell it what you want it to let you control. In this case, you could customize your control center to add or remove any kind of tool, as it also has the option to turn off the microphone. It can also show us how much battery our wireless keyboard has left, and when we are in multi-screen mode, it can also help us to turn off this second screen in case we need it for some reason. And notice that this other option is going to allow us to have a very different interaction with these two monitors. For example, if we are going to place this computer on a table, we can rotate monitor 1 so that the other person can see it properly, and this second monitor we can see it from the front. Or we can mirror our screen as well so that both screens show the same thing but with a different rotation. As you can see, this allows us to work, and the other person can be seeing perfectly well that same image or that work we are doing. So these are interesting modes. It is up to you as a user how you want to use it. You could also block the rotation, and it has even more options. For example, to have a different layout of our windows in Windows, or also to directly open the control panel, which is another option I'm going to tell you about in a moment, which you can enjoy in this secondary screen. But before we go to talk about it, let me tell you that it also offers us a shortcut to Quick Key. which is also a menu that can get to help you quite a bit when you have it on the second monitor because it gives you quick slashes to options like copy, cut, paste, and more. So here we're already looking at some of the additional tools that you can take advantage of on the secondary screen, but it's also going to give us this handwriting option, which again you can move to the second monitor and see how you could now write directly by hand and then insert the text digitally. Honestly, it's not that practical because it will be very time consuming to be typing this way. Also, you have to tap before inserting the text and it doesn't have a space bar, so honestly I didn't find this tool the most attractive. However, one thing that can come in handy is the numeric keypad that you can open up, which again can be very useful to have on this secondary screen if you're doing a lot of number crunching tasks. But before I tell you more about the secondary screen tasks, let me tell you all about the ASUS Pen 2.0. As you notice, it has a hidden USB-C port on this part with which you can get to charge it and link it with your computer. In addition, it also has 2 buttons on this part, but it doesn't integrate any of ASUS's own apps for taking notes or anything like that. So in this case, I will use Microsoft Whiteboard, which is the application that all Windows computers come with for this kind of scenario. Honestly, the pen has quite a lot of latency. It does not feel supernatural writing, and note that in this case, it is able to distinguish the finger and the pen as different elements. So in that aspect, it does perform well. And as I told you, it does have different levels of pressure, so if you write by pressing very lightly, the line will be very thin, and if you press harder, it will make a stronger line. So we are going to have a good pen interaction. In this case, the button can be used to erase while holding down on it, and the second button, you could also have it as another type of tool, but again, I don't see an application to specifically configure the behavior of the buttons. So the stylus seems to me to be a tool that will be more for annotations in your documents, but it does not seem to me a tool that will be useful for taking notes, but more focused on reviewing your documents or making a specific note or pointing. In addition, the stylus is not able to stick magnetically to the computer, but you have to keep it in its case. Finally, let me tell you about the ASUS Dial-In Control Panel application, which will allow you to customize all the controls that will appear on the secondary screen. For example, by default, this panel appears system-wide, but you can also configure individually for each application which panel you want to appear. For example, in Photoshop, all of these options will appear. The configuration is already set by default, so you don't need to modify it, but you should know that if the keyboard shortcuts are different from the English and Spanish version of your favorite applications, you might have some difficulties. For example, in Microsoft Word, I had to reconfigure these controls. To have such an experience, notice how we have the brightness control in this part. We could also start the snipping tool, so you can get to have nice shortcuts in this part. And I added some buttons, for example, so we can bold text directly from this part without having to go select the specific button above, or also in italics. So anything that has a keyboard shortcut, you can transform it into a button of this style. In fact, it also has a slider for the font size, but this is where we start with difficulties since it is configured for the shortcuts of the English version. If the keyboard shortcuts in Spanish are different, in this case we will encounter difficulties because it will not respond to this control that is already configured. And notice how in Photoshop we would also have a fairly large panel of new controls. For example, we can activate the lasso tool or the brush tool. And as you notice, it does make the specific change directly from these controls. So it can be quite useful for some people who tend to use several shortcuts. Remember, any keyboard shortcut like Ctrl-C or Ctrl-V, you can transform it into a button or a control with sliders. For example, notice how we have the zoom control in this slider, or we can also access the brush tool and we can change the brush size directly with this other slider. The tool works, although it seems to me that it could still be improved, but it definitely strikes me how we could even modify the opacity of certain layers directly from this part. Although the response doesn't seem to be 100% fast as you can see, but it is attractive all your distribution of controls that you can get to have in this part below. Notice how we can also log in to edit all of our controls. For example, this button that I set to be a bold button. I can name it, I can tell it what keyboard shortcut I want to replace that button, and I can even customize its color, the size of the button, or if I want it to be a rotary dial, and here I can have various tools that I want to be the ones that I want it to perform. And that's it. I can create my own dashboard for the applications I want, although by default it comes with some preloaded dashboards, for example, for Excel, for PowerPoint, and in this case we saw the one for Photoshop. There is also a special one available for Illustrator or Premiere so you could improve your workflow. It's like adding special buttons to your keyboard to have shortcuts instead of having to press multiple keys for all the shortcuts. Only I insist everything is perfectly optimized for the keyboard configured in English, but in Spanish some shortcuts might not respond very well and you have to enter this section to try to configure them so that they respond correctly. And finally, I must tell you that with 6 fingers on the screen, you can display the keyboard as you will notice. If you slide this keyboard down, you will notice that the trackpad area is removed so you can take advantage of this part for your special button boards or for anything else. We can also enable a small trackpad in this corner to be able to control the screen. Although being a touch screen, it ends up being more practical to control it with your finger directly. But in case you need a cursor, you can enable it here, and again if you slide with 6 fingers up, you can have the keyboard occupying all the space. But although it is very useful to have tools on this screen, I must say that sometimes it is a bit complex to configure the position. For example, in this case, the numeric keypad was placed on top of my control panel, and that obviously causes me an unsatisfactory experience. I have to try to close it and accommodate it. So the idea is good, but the implementation could be improved, especially when putting and changing all these secondary screen controls. At the security level, we will find something curious because it does not bring fingerprint reader. That could be its main disadvantage in this regard. You will not have that level of convenience, but you do have facial recognition through Windows Hello. This facial recognition is supported by an infrared projector, so it can offer a good level of security, although I would love to have both facial recognition and fingerprint reader. Notice how in this case it is doing the scanning and after that the registration will be ready. So it can help you log in, or you also have many other alternatives up to a USB security key. And if you have your account set up, you can also get to encrypt your entire device to prevent anyone from getting access to your files without your authorization. So that's about security. Let's talk about the battery, because in this case we're going to find a capacity of 75 watt-hours. In other words, it's a considerably large battery, and I must say that in this case it has a fairly efficient processor. As usual in my tests, I run a battery drainer. In this case, it stresses the CPU as much as it can, using all of its cores, and having this application running, the computer was able to reach about 2 hours and 52 minutes. So it confirms to us that it has a big battery, a considerably efficient processor, although I insist it is not the most advanced in the industry, but the battery does deliver. Remember that the charger is quite compact and small, supporting 65 watts charging through a USB-C connector. In 15 minutes of charging it recovered 20%, in 30 minutes it recovered 39%, and in an hour and a half it got close to 90%. But from there it got very slow, so the full charge finished it in 2 hours. Obviously, that final slowness is to try to take care of the battery life. However, through the My ASUS app, you can also have a way to take care of your battery by locking the charge up to 80%. This can be very useful if you are one of those users who need to have the power plugged in at all times to your computer, so I recommend that you enable this option so that your battery doesn't degrade as quickly. Let's go for an application opening test while I tell you that it has the Intel Core Ultra 9 processor, specifically the 185H model. It also has an NPU to be used in artificial intelligence tools, now that this topic is so fashionable. It also brings the new Intel Arc graphics. No dedicated graphics, so it's not so focused on graphics power, but that will also help the battery. It also has 32 GB of RAM, LPDDR5X, and 2 TB of M2 solid-state storage, which can certainly come to offer us also very good speed. And presto, it took 4.4 seconds on average to open each application, showing that it has enough fluency. It is not going to be the fastest computer, as I told you throughout the video, but it does offer a good level of speed. This first test was with the balance mode, but now we are going to do a test with the performance mode. Because as you remember, in Windows we have different performance profiles, so if you want the most powerful, you have to select the performance profile, and in this case we're going to be plugged into the power. And it improved considerably. Now its average was 3.2 seconds. Obviously the simplest applications, it opened them with too much speed, and the complex ones was where it got to take a little longer, and that's why the average was slightly raised, but honestly it has a good performance. You have to consider that this is a laptop with 2 screens and with all this productivity, and it maintains, as I say, a very good performance. Next we're going to test the RAM, because notice that we've already opened up a very simple project in Premiere. We also have Lightroom open with some photographs. Here in Photoshop we're going to open up a project as well, and in the other applications we're also going to open up some projects or documents to get a little bit more complete view of the performance that it might have. And I've already got several tabs open in the browser as well, so we're going to do this test of how it's performing. See how everything is running right now. Let's now switch between all the applications that I already had open, and simply put, the performance is still very good. Definitely with this RAM capacity and this good processor, we are going to have a good performance for everyday use. Obviously, applications that require a high graphics processing are not gonna have enough power in this computer, but other than that, any other application I think can run in a fairly loose and fluid way on this computer. Let's test how long it takes to export this 1-minute video recorded at 4K. We will use codec H.264 and it has a total duration of 1 minute. Now let's wait to find out its final time. That's it. It took about 36 seconds with the high performance profile. Not bad at all, although, as I told you, it's not a computer totally focused on giving you a very high performance in high graphics processing applications. But if you are more into benchmarks, let me tell you that while we had it plugged to the power in multi-core in Cinebench, it gave us 9,551 points in single-core, 1,790, and unplugged from the power in multi-core, it reached 8,527 points, and in single-core, 1,319. Let's go test some games, although in this case I installed several games a little more complex, but for some strange reason they did not open, so I ended up trying simpler games, starting with Asphalt 9, which we set to 120 frames per second with no limit and obviously activated all possible effects. Unplugged from the power, it got up to about 112 frames per second at some points, but it did have some jitter, so the lowest peak was about 50. It doesn't freeze completely, but it does get to suffer at times. The maximum temperature in this test reached 43.8 degrees Celsius on the external lid, although when we connected it to the power, we noticed that there is not so much difference when it is plugged or unplugged, and neither was able to reach 120 frames per second, staying at 115, although it did get hotter when it was plugged into the power. In the case of Fortnite, notice that it is set at 60 frames per second by default. It doesn't have motion blur enabled, and in several parameters we're going to find the settings set to high quality. When unplugged, it is definitely not going to be recommended to play because there are constant hindrances, confirming that it is not a computer focused on gaming. As I've been telling you before, for applications or games with high graphics processing, it will fall very short. It barely reached 15 frames per second at its best moments, and the heating reached 45.1 degrees Celsius on the outer lid. Plugged into the power, we again notice similar performance, meaning we're not going to have a super smooth experience if it sits at a very low frames per second rate. So we confirm that if your priority is to play, you do need to purchase a computer with dedicated graphics, since Intel's integrated graphics, despite being the latest generation, for games are still lacking. Although for video editing we saw in 4K it can still be good enough for some users. Finally, in Henshin Impact we have the medium quality by default and we leave it in that configuration. Also, it supports 60 frames per second and several parameters are set to medium quality. And in this case, again, we notice that it's not a 100% smooth gaming experience. Yes, it's going to have some stumbles, some frame drops. Although in this case, it wasn't as bad as Fortnite, as it did get up to 50 frames per second, even unplugged. But definitely the most demanding gamers are going to feel that this experience is not smooth at all. When we plugged it into power, it did manage to get up to 60 frames per second. But again, there were hitches, though maybe a little less. But either way, it's not a computer I'm going to recommend for playing this type of content. Only for more casual games, or maybe you're going to need to set the graphics quality as low as possible in order to have a slightly smoother experience. And that brings us to the end of this review. In conclusion, I find it a very attractive computer for those who are looking for a high level of productivity. If you are a user who likes to work with 2 monitors at the same time and would like to have that experience but in a portable way, I think it is a good working tool. For gaming, it definitely won't be a good tool, so it's up to you as a user. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, you know you can tell us about it, and we'll see you next time.